All right, welcome back to the Scientific Guidance Panel meeting. We have all the panel members here back, and I'd like to pick up where we left off. We left off with a motion. There was a proposal that didn't have a majority vote, and so at this point, I'd like to actually. It seems that we're at a stalemate with this regard, and whether or not we're going to take additional action or make additional recommendations. So I thought, if the panel members don't mind, I'd like to ask Dr. Denton if she has a suggestion on how we might be able to take some next steps.
Obviously, this is a new program for all of us, and we're feeling our way through, and we look very seriously upon the recommendations that the panel is giving us on these chemicals. And I think that the ambivalence of the panel on this last item, the 4-4 split vote, indicates that it probably would be the best thing would be for us to gather the information that has been promised that would be provided to us. We could do an additional literature search. We could provide that information to the panel, and I think turn it around in a fairly short time and bring it back to the panel to see if there could be more of a consensus on how we ought to approach it. So I think a little time is warranted at this point.
Could the panel members at this meeting now make recommendations to program staff as to what information would be necessary so that when we meet again, everyone on this panel is comfortable with a vote of whether or not to designate this group, this class of chemicals?
Certainly. I think if you recommended that we obtain the information that the speakers, the public commenters promised, that we do an additional literature search, and any additional information that you would want to be provided, that's appropriate, and we can bring it back and consider it again.
All right. Well then, ask the panel members if that would be satisfactory.
I have one note of caution, is that I guess I would like to hear something a little more specific from the panel members about what really would make, what pieces of information are really missing from the current package. Because otherwise it can end up in these open-ended situations where we say, oh, well, we would welcome more information, and we can get, volumes of information sent to the panel from numerous interested parties on every single one of the chemicals that we're considering designating, and sending the signal that we're open to, delaying and looking at everything that anybody might choose to send us is, I think, risky, just because it can, in the future, bog down our process. And I think one of our goals has been to really look at the key pieces of information that we think we need in order to meet our charge and stay focused on those. And if we feel that those pieces of information are there, then we're able to move forward with the decision.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think we've determined earlier today that information that was offered by the industry representatives today wouldn't be coming to the panel. They'd be going to program staff, and program staff will take that information and also obtain additional information under the guidance of this panel. And I think we can make those recommendations. I suggest we make those recommendations right now to program staff as to what information is necessary, and for the following reason: for this panel to feel, every member of this panel to feel comfortable to vote yes or no vote on whether to designate this class of chemicals.
I would have the further suggestion that we limit information to only peer-reviewed information.
Yeah, George Alexeyev. Well, I was hoping we could include a report that we have prepared for the Air Resources Board on siloxanes. So, okay.
In addition, I think a lot from personal communications that staff have had with experts throughout the U.S. For example, on the diesel exhaust question, that I think has been valuable for us. I wouldn't want to exclude that information in this matter.
May I respond to that?
Oh.
Okay. I agree with you that there is a lot of important information that has not been peer reviewed. But if we receive that sort of information, then this group needs to serve the function of being a peer review group. Mm-hmm. We need to decide among ourselves whether we classify that information as scientifically.
Mm-hmm. Would it be satisfactory to panel members if if information is brought to the attention of the panel members by the program staff and it's not peer reviewed, that the program staff should make it clear that it's not peer reviewed information that is being presented to us?
I mean, it's apparent, I think, in the citations that have been given thus far that personal communications and also reports have been cited. So I suppose further clarification might be helpful. But I guess another area of information that I've specifically requested has been from the industry representative that is useful to us on trends and uses of these substances in California. And that's not going to be peer reviewed, but is important information.
I would say I'm also particularly interested in the laboratory feasibility and QA/QC issues around actually conducting the measurements, meaningful measurements.
I would support the chair's recommendation that the origin of information be clearly identified. And I agree, when we look down the list of criteria that this committee is charged with evaluating, frankly, if we restrict it to peer-reviewed information only, some of these questions just aren't amenable to being that way. So, for example, the need to assess the efficacy of public health actions or the availability of adequate biospecimen samples. These are things that we need to gather through sort of a broader look and a discussion with laboratory experts and such. So I don't think we should limit ourselves.
My comments were with regard to scientific information that would allow us to determine whether or not there are significant health effects. The issue of how widely the possible public exposure is doesn't come into that category. I'm only talking about the biological and health information.
All right. So we've had some suggestions made by panel members on with regards to peer review literature when it's appropriate to use to rely on that. Also, non-peer reviewed literature, and there's instances where that's most appropriate. And I think the point's been stated very clearly. Are there, if I may ask the panel members, is there anything else that panel members would want now that we have the program staff here? Anything else you would want clarification on, or information that was already presented, or do you need anything else in terms of information that wasn't presented today, so that when we come back and address this topic again, every one of us will have the information we need to make a decision?
I guess the three things that I think are important to me. One is the concern from the industry representative that existing studies pertaining to the bioaccumulative properties of these substances are invalid for methodological and laboratory contamination reasons. I would be interested in your assessment of that claim. Second, the information if there is additional information on the hazardous properties. and toxicity, toxicity questions, if there's additional information beyond those that were provided to us. And third, information on uses and expected uses in California, not only in dry cleaning, but is in other products as that information is available.
Additional recommendations, requests of the panel members to program staff? Actually, Dr. Culver and then Dr. Litter.
Well, let Dr. Litter go first because Mike is a little bit off the track.
Okay, I just wanted to add to the things that the panel members had already mentioned, that the types of information that I think would be information that was mentioned earlier about dermal uptake of these compounds and measurements in plasma. So in addition to the methods for measurement, but levels in plasma, as well as the metabolism of these compounds. Something that we didn't really talk about, but it sounds like if these are excreted in the urine, that's something down the road in the future that might be more feasible than measuring the parent compounds, might be measuring metabolites. So I think it would be useful to have that information.
Well, on that, one thing we should add that came up is the feasibility of breath samples, because these are volatile. So it might, the best biomarker may actually be breath and or some other biological medium.
I'm sorry. Could you please repeat that, George Alexander?
I said because the discussion went to volatilization through breathing, it would indicate that for these compounds, breath samples, right, might be, not my point. It was actually Dr. Lipsett's point.
One of my underlying concerns, I think, is that we don't just by rote add every single chemical or designate every single chemical as a potential designated chemical. We have two screens. We have the pre-screen, which is the first list, and then the second screen, which identifies the ones that we want to go ahead and actually do work on. So both screens have to perform a function. And so we have to look at each chemical carefully before we decide that it is a designated or is potentially a designated chemical. And I'd like us to consider those very carefully, and maybe we need better criteria to define that screen. It's rather loose at the moment.
I have one more just specific comment or request.
Sure.
The email, I think it was from the environmental working group, asked about linear siloxanes, and maybe you can provide us some information on that and whether those are could be bundled in the same analysis with the flow siloxanes, and if there's any relevant information about those.
So moving to the Lauren Zeiss with OEHA, just wondering if with the linear siloxanes you're asking for us to broaden again the class, because what we had done was building on the panel's recommendation to look at D4 and the methyl siloxanes,
right,
focused on the most similar to the D5 rather. Are you asking for a broadening?
Yes, I guess I am. I just feel like I want to be responsive to those public comments and learn more about those.
Okay. Any more requests of the panel to program staff? If not, then then, yes, Dr. Zeiss.
Could I just ask for a little bit more clarification on what you would be looking for the methylsiloxanes? If you want a greater another write-up similar to what we have on the possible designated chemicals, or just what level of response are you looking for on that?
In the comment we got by email, and perhaps there's more detail available on that. If I understood correctly, these compounds are similar chemically to the other cyclosiloxanes, and that they potentially are analyzable with the same kinds of methods. So if they're kind of in part of the class, and again, I mean, here's where I would need more information about that wouldn't in fact be similar to what was provided in the write-up. Are they widely used? Are there similar health concerns? As with the other compounds, maybe we should be considering these in this group.
Okay, I just wanted to, Lauren Zeiss again, I just want to clarify that this could potentially be a very large class of chemicals. And initially we had considered the methylsiloxane, so we are potentially talking about a very large number. In a complex set.
Well, if I could...
I just have a suggestion for narrowing it down.
Okay.
I would, and it goes back to what we talked about as a big part of our criteria for a screen, is we picked out the cyclic siloxanes because of the very large volumes and the fact that we had several studies, including the ones we did on computer and office equipment, showing very large emissions. And levels, there are 2 studies of indoor environments in Germany and North America that report high levels indoors. That drove us, I think, to pull these up. So I would put the same test as the very first screen before you even give it to us. If there aren't high levels or any studies showing measurements indoors or at some level that would flag them, then don't go through all the other parts that we had to. Does that? I think that might be a way to...
I think that's reasonable.
Right. Instead of doing, because there was a huge amount of work to do chemicals here, but these were narrowed down through this process of looking at literature showing concentration measurements indoors, high levels of production, high levels of use, changing patterns of use.
Okay. Might I suggest at the next, later on the agenda, we have an update item, and we wanted to have some discussion around the agenda for the next meeting as part of that item. And so I think one of the issues will be, well, what work should we do first? Because we also would like to move to considering some priorities for sampling as well. So maybe we could revisit that issue about what to bring you information on next, and see how you like to,
right.
what
maybe
you recommend us.
I'll do some homework too.
Okay.
Yeah. Could I also interject a brief comment in this regard? And that is that, going back to my presentation yesterday, recall that OEHA has 2 staff who are DES program, and they have a number of other who are contributing time to be able to respond and to staff the panel. So I guess on the one hand, we want to be as responsive as we can to all the requests from the panel for information. On the other hand, I would want to request the panel, when they're asking for additional information, that it be considered critical to your decision making and not just in the nice to know arena. Okay.
Thank you. One point I want to, or comment I have, is that the class of chemicals that we just discussed, we had a process, and we had both panel member input and program staff input to get to where we're at. And the next few steps that we're asking for within that classification, more information, would just be to additional information, and I think that's probably, Dr. Zeiss, it's probably feasible to just get that additional information and bring it back, and so we can complete the process and make a decision on this class. The recommendation for Dr. Bradman, I think, is new work, and I'd like to remind everyone that the process is going to be a little bit different, which means we may not be able to come back in the same timely manner that we did with the first group of chemicals that we're considering today. And so we should if we could come back at the end of the day and discuss that in the context of everything else we're going to be asking program staff to do.
Yeah, and I'll do some of my own homework on that. I just want to make sure we're responsive to those comments.
In my mind, Michael, it's the challenge for me is and the need for additional information is to be able to weigh this class of substances against others that we're looking at, sort of vis-a-vis their public health risk. So I appreciate that we're adding a burden to the staff in doing that, but it's important, I guess, in that regard. So I guess I would make a proposal, if the chair is amenable to it, that on the matter of cyclosiloxanes, that the panel defer decision on designation until staff have gathered and assessed additional information as specified by the panel.
If it's appropriate, I'd like to go ahead and just make that as a general guidance to program without making a proposal for a recommendation. Would that be all right? Okay with panel members? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes. Okay, thanks. With that, I think we can move on. Oh, yeah, thanks. I lost it.
We did get an additional comment that came in during the panel's discussion of the first recommendation. It was a comment from Dr. Amy Kyle of UC Berkeley. It was beyond the public comment period, and although we won't be discussing that or reading that into the record, we will give it to the court reporter to be made part of the public record. Okay, good enough?
Yeah. Okay. All right, thanks. All right, panel members, it's 2:35, and what we had scheduled for the next topic after lunch was antimicrobials and synthetic hormones used in animal husbandry. That was originally scheduled to start at 1:45. So we are 50 minutes. I looked at how long it would take, how much time we scheduled for this, including public comment and final panel discussion recommendations, and it was about an hour's worth of time. An hour. We were to start at 1:45, and we were to break at 2:45. So that looks, it's about an hour. If we were to start now and get through that topic on time, it would be 3:35, and we were scheduled to have a break. And if we had a break at 3:45, we're looking at 4 o'clock before we get to the last item, which was update on pesticides, plasticizers, the flame retardants. And in that section, we were also going to talk about giving this panel an opportunity to discuss what we would like to see in the next on the next agenda for the next meeting, because we heard, I think yesterday, some eagerness to start working towards prioritization. Yes.
May I make a suggestion? I asked Dr. Flessel a question earlier about the laboratory capabilities on measuring antimicrobial resistance. And it appears that it could be useful for a conversation to occur with the microbial disease lab here in the state of California, which I guess there hasn't yet been the time for that to happen, to assess what exactly they're doing, what their capabilities are, and what their interest might be in collaborating on a project like this, since we, as we all know, the biomonitoring labs at the program's disposal are not able to measure for bacterial resistance, which is the issue at hand in the next discussion. So I would propose that in the interest of time, we perhaps skip over this agenda item and allow staff the opportunity to have that conversation and bring it back at the next meeting. Should I do that as a formal?
How does the other panel members feel about that? Sure, Dr. Denton.
I'm wondering if there's anyone from the public that is here to testify on that item that came specifically for that item. And it doesn't look like there is anyone. Okay.
Okay. Well, I understand that Dr. Rachel Orsman was going to give that presentation, and we really do want to get to this topic, but for now, then, if I guess at this point we'll move on to the next topic, which is going to be the update on pesticides, plasticizers, and we'll from that point on we'll resume that as scheduled with that topic, and we will also include a discussion on the agenda for next, and we'll see where we're at with that. Sure.
I'm not sure exactly what, I didn't catch which laboratory but I actually was in communication with one of the researchers in the CDPH lab, and I'm not sure if that's the same lab.
It's exactly the same lab, yes, and the person.
So I have that question, which
and
the punchline to the whole presentation. But
Okay, well then.
I mean, I would suggest that she go ahead and do her presentation. You can have an initial discussion. You don't have to make your decision, and then, yeah, that won't take long.
Sounds fine.
I would like to hear the presentation as well. If we could then curtail discussion, I think.
Council, can we abbreviate that, or do we still have to have public commenting?
You still need to offer public comment, but if there's no one that's commenting, then there's not going to be a lot of time spent on that.
Okay. So
you don't have to have your deliberations and stuff today, but it is kind of difficult sometimes to have a presentation and then try and remember it later and without having to redo the whole thing the next time you consider it.
Well, okay. All right. Well, Dr. Royson, thank you for bringing that to our attention. Back to the panel. Shall we go ahead and go back and hear the topic on antimicrobials? All right. Well, let's move forward and we'll try to keep the cut down. Yes. Go ahead, Dr. Roseman.
How's that? Yeah. Okay, so I was going to speak on two topics that have some overlap. The use of antimicrobials in animal husbandry and the use of synthetic hormones in animal husbandry. I'll start with antimicrobials. So the first slide, which may be difficult to read, is a table showing a select group of classes of antimicrobials that are registered for use in livestock and poultry for the purposes of both treatment and prevention of infections as well as growth promotion. And you'll see that there are some that are used exclusively in animals, for instance, the ionophores, which are on the top left corner there of the table. Although more than half of the antimicrobials that are used for non-therapeutic purposes in animals are used to treat human disease. In particular, you'll notice there are a couple in orange there, like virginiamycin, which are used to treat human disease, and there are not very many alternatives. That virginiamycin is a close relative of an antibiotic that's kind of a last-ditch treatment in humans for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus infections, which have become increasingly prevalent and serious in humans, and is also a last-ditch treatment for vancomycin-resistant enterococcus, which is another potentially fatal infection. So some of the challenges with a topic such as this is that there's no required reporting of the use of antimicrobial agents in food animals, either in terms of the quantities used or whether they're used for growth promotion or for treatment or prevention of infections. And you can see there's a wide range in terms of the actual numbers, the amount of antimicrobials used based on the animal that you're talking about and the specific antimicrobial. Estimates vary widely, but there are estimates that between 40 and 70% of total antimicrobial use in the United States is for non-therapeutic purposes in livestock, meaning either to prevent disease or, for the most part, it's for growth promotion. And exposure in humans occurs via two major mechanisms, either consumption of commercial meat products or via environmental exposure, usually through antimicrobials contained in animal waste. So in regards to the first point, the consumption of commercial meat products, the FDA regulates the use of antimicrobials that can be used in animals, and then the USDA, through the Food Safety Inspection Service, which they have a national residue program, they do the actual testing, and they test a fairly small number of animals to see if they before slaughter, to see if they have tissue levels of antimicrobials that are above tolerance levels that have been set by the FDA. And as I mentioned, it's fairly small sampling, and very rare residue violations are detected. In terms of environmental exposure, it's thought to be fairly significant. The antimicrobials are not well absorbed in animals, and a large percentage of them, of the parent compound, in addition to any metabolites, are thought to be excreted. And the antimicrobial residue, as well as resistant organisms, which I'll talk about more in a minute, tend to persist in animal waste. So the major health concern when you're talking about antimicrobials is not direct toxicity from antimicrobial residues in humans. And we found very little literature, if any, that was looking at antimicrobial residues in humans and making any connection to toxicity. The major health concern is the development of drug-resistant bacteria that are then transmitted from animals to humans via a variety of mechanisms, either through consumption of contaminated meat or animal-to-human transfer. This could either be from a farm animal to somebody who works on the farm, or from a farm animal to another type of animal, an insect, a rodent, and all this has been demonstrated in studies. And then the resistant bacteria is transmitted to humans at that point. And then there's also pretty significant evidence of environmental transfer of resistant organisms, and there have been all of these mechanisms have been in a variety of ways, but they've been able to trace resistant organisms that end up in humans either back to food crops or soil, or to animals that have been exposed to antimicrobials on the farm somewhere. And these organisms tend to persist. They don't go away. In terms of the question of the efficacy of public health action, so antibiotic resistance is a large and growing public health problem. Losing effective treatments in humans is a significant concern. The development of multi-drug resistant bacteria can cause significant health problems in humans. And so monitoring antibiotic resistance in humans could be a tool both to reduce the non-essential antibiotic use that occurs in food animal production as well as in human clinical medicine. Depending on the antimicrobial that you were talking, it would be difficult to distinguish between these two, because there are a number of the antimicrobials that are used both in animals and in humans, and you wouldn't really be able to tell an organism that was resistant to a particular antimicrobial that's used in animals and humans. It would be difficult to figure out where that resistant organism was coming from. So laboratory considerations are fairly significant. As I mentioned, I didn't find any data on levels of antimicrobial residues in humans, and that does not appear to be where people are focusing or the major scientific interest. What is of great scientific interest is the resistant organisms, not on the antimicrobial residues. So don't think that detecting antimicrobial residues is likely to be fruitful. We're talking about very long-term but low-dose exposure to the antimicrobials in animals. A lot of the compounds are water-soluble. And just an additional consideration to keep in mind would be that any biomonitoring antimicrobials, you'd have to take into account in the questionnaire what the person's use of antimicrobials is, because the doses that an individual would be exposed to because they're being treated for an infection would be much higher than what you would expect them to be exposed to from consumption of contaminated meat. So an alternative biomonitoring approach that would really get at the question of interest would be to biomonitor for microorganisms and then do further testing for resistance patterns. And this would be a completely different way of addressing this issue, but would really get at what everybody is interested in, which is whether or the extent to which resistant organisms develop in animals because they're exposed to these antimicrobials, and then the transmission of those resistant organisms from animals to humans. And you could do this in one of two ways, either by looking at gastrointestinal flora in stool cultures or by looking at upper respiratory tract flora in nasal swab cultures. However, capacity for this type of testing is not something that the CDPH lab or the DTSC labs do. I think the laboratory that was in question earlier, I spoke with someone there. That's not testing that that aspect of the California Department of Public Health labs does. This work would need to be done by collaboration with outside researchers who would need to have experience with this particular type of testing and presumably some funding for it as well. Now, I was going to go straight into synthetic hormones unless anybody wants to ask a question.
So I just want to make sure that I heard that right. So the California Microbiology Lab basically said that they won't do this or they can't do this, and so they're not interested in developing anything like this?
Correct.
Okay.
The type of test they said they receive isolates from other places. This sort of broad sampling of GI flora or is a very different type of testing than what they're used to doing. So the next topic, which has some overlap, is synthetic hormones used in animal husbandry. There are 3 synthetic hormones that are approved for use, regulated by the FDA in animals. Zeranol, which is a synthetic estrogen, it's administered by implantation of a pellet behind the ear that continuously releases the compound. Of note, Zeranol shares metabolites with a mycotoxin that's produced by fungi that commonly contaminate corn, and this will be an issue later when we talk about the laboratory issues. Second synthetic hormone is trenbolone acetate, TBA, which is a synthetic androgen, and that's also administered by this continuously releasing hormone pellet. And the third synthetic hormone is melangestrol acetate, or MGA, which is a synthetic progestin. And this is administered in cattle feed, not by pellet. And it's also used, in addition to its use for growth promotion, it's used for estrus synchronization and suppression. And, I'll note here that a number of these chemicals, when they're administered to animals, they're often administered in combination either with each other or with natural hormones because natural hormones are also administered for growth promotion in animals. In terms of exposure, potential exposure, again, there's no mandated volume of use reporting. What we do know is that the vast majority of cattle are implanted at least once in their lifetime with or a combination of synthetic and natural hormones, and that many cattle will receive more than one implant. And again, the primary exposure in humans is either via consumption of contaminated meat or from environmental exposure through animal waste. Consumption of commercial meat products, similar issues as with antimicrobials. The FDA regulates and sets tolerance levels. The USDA, through the Food Safety Inspection Service and the National Residue Program, does this testing. And they test a fairly small number of samples, and they detect a very small number of residue violations. And these all relate to what the FDA has decided is appropriate tolerance levels. Environmental exposure, again, thought to be significant. There have been some estimates on the extent to which both synthetic and natural hormones are added to the environment above kind of base levels just because of their use for growth promotion in animals, and that those percentages up there represent. And livestock farming is thought to be a major source of steroid hormones found in regional groundwater and external surface water. And the mechanism for this, again, is that these compounds end up in animal waste, which as manure could be applied as fertilizer or remains in feedlot retention ponds, and from there it may be retained in soil or transported to ground and surface water. all these compounds have shown some evidence of persistence in the environment. Zeranol has been found in low concentrations in sewage discharge. TBA metabolites are stable in animal waste and have long half-lives in liquid manure. MGA, similar story, was present for a long time after fertilization with solid dung, and also has been found to be present after crops were cultivated on that soil. The health effects into great detail, and these are synthetic hormones. The health effects are thought to be, expected to be the same as those for the natural version. So Zeranol is a natural estrogen, the known cause of human breast and uterine cancer. TBA is a member of is an anabolic steroid, which are listed as reproductive toxicants and listed under Proposition 65. MGA is a progesterone, which is also listed as known to cause cancer under Proposition 65. And what's important is that it can be difficult to quantify the health effects from exposure to Zeranol, but the concern really is for the additive effects of Zeranol on top of other exposures to natural estrogens, and that's difficult to quantify. I should also add here that the additional complication with Zeranol is that it does share these metabolites with the mycotoxin, and so there have been really the close came to finding studies that looked at the relationship between synthetic hormones in humans and adverse health effects was with Zeranol, and there has been an association made between some of the Zeranol metabolites and precocious puberty in young girls. These compounds do have significance in terms of the ability to assess efficacy of public health actions. There's concern regarding their persistence and toxicity in the environment. Biomonitoring could be helpful in our efforts to keep synthetic hormones out of the food supply and out of the environment. Again, it could be difficult to determine if the source of exposure is used in animal husbandry, in particular for Zeranol, where there's this additional exposure through the mycotoxin, and then with TBA, since that can be used as illegally, it's an anabolic steroid that people can ingest that way. So just the presence of these synthetic hormones in humans wouldn't necessarily tell you where they were coming from, although there are some lab methods to try to distinctions, but it could be complicated. And then finally, lab considerations. So there's fairly limited experience with measuring these synthetic hormones in humans. There are sensitive methods that exist for detecting their use in animals. In part, this is because the use of these hormones in animals has been banned in the European community, and so they do have some sensitive methods that they've developed in order to help them figure out where there are violations. But there hasn't been nearly as much attention paid to measuring these low levels of these hormones in humans. The equipment to do the type of testing is available in the lab, but development work would be necessary to establish and validate these methods.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Roisman, for that presentation. If I could draw the panel's attention to the fact that we have 2 panel members that need to leave at 4. Is that right? Dr. Denton is sharing with me that it'll probably take an hour to get through the second. We haven't. The next section has an hour scheduled. So if we were going to include, we'd like, of course, want to include our all panel members in discussion of the agenda item for next meeting. So if we got started on the next section at 3 o'clock, that gives us about 5 minutes right now to comment with regards to this presentation.
I'm going to ask one more time whether there's public comment.
I'm sorry?
You want to ask one more time about
Sure.
public comment?
Thank you. Is there anyone in the public who's here today that would like to comment on the presentation that was just provided to the panel? I don't see any. So, some quick comments from panel members on the presentation or points of clarification we have? Yes.
Well, one thing I just wanted to maybe propose is in the interest of us just having heard this excellent presentation, and then having a long time delay in between we actually get to discuss it as a panel, whether it might be possible to do something like in the relatively near future of a teleconference that would include the whole panel that would be open to the public. That might be one way to, just sort of throwing it out here as a possibility.
Well, it's certainly not impossible to do a teleconference under the law, but it is difficult in terms of logistics because you end up, you can't have the members being in their offices, for example, or on a cell phone. Wherever the members are, it needs to be open to the public. So what you end up having is like a group here and a group here, and you're staffing both locations, and it logistically is very difficult.
So you can't have the public call in?
No.
Oh.
I mean, you have to have, well, the public could call in, but where you have to have a physical where the public can be with the panel members that are on the call. So that you'd have to open your office, for example, or you would have to go to another place where the public could be. So it's not as simple as just doing here's the call-in number, anybody can talk.
So Lawrence Ice with OEA, one possibility to explore, and we could try to do this, would be to look at if you have locations on campus, and Dr. Culver could join you there, and then we could look at a location up here. So we can explore that as a possibility.
Any other comments by panel members? It's okay. Well, thank you again. We're going to go ahead then and move on to the next portion of the meeting, which is an update on pesticides, plasticizers, other flame retardants, and Track 2 compounds. And who will be making that presentation? Okay. Is this Sarah? Okay, thanks.
Okay, I'm just going to give you a brief update on the outstanding issues, and then I'm going to do some points of discussion that have come up from yesterday and today, just to remind you of what might be on future agendas. So there are a couple remaining potential designated chemicals left over from the June meeting, and there was also what we called Track 2, and that was a broader scoping of some high-use, high-exposure chemicals, some toxicity concerns. Let's see. Okay, so with regard to pesticides, there has been some initial scoping work done, and the focus has been on looking for high-use chemicals. There's also some initial modeling work that Dr. McCone has been doing. We've also been looking into pet pesticides and other consumer pesticide products. In terms of plasticizers, there's just a very initial investigation underway on emerging plasticizers. In terms of flame retardants, as was mentioned, the topic was narrowed from flame retardants to the brominated and chlorinated flame retardants. So there's been some initial work on non-halogenated organophosphate flame retardants. With regard to the so-called Track 2 chemicals, there were a couple things identified in June. One was nitrosodimethylamine. As part of work group discussions, there was a suggestion that broadened to emerging drinking water contaminants. And then cleaning agents was another area of investigation. Glycol ethers was the main focus of this, and again, we've been looking into things that have a combination of high use and toxicity concerns. So possible topics for the next SGP meeting agenda, and actually, okay, so I think actually in making this slide there was a typo. Let me go back one. it's not emerging drinking water contaminants. It's emerging drinking water disinfection byproducts is what that slide should actually read. And then in terms of possible topics for the next SGP meeting agenda, there was some advice on study designs, which was discussed yesterday. There's some desire for more panel input on that. Also, consideration of additional potential designated chemicals. So we request panel input on those of greatest interest. As was just mentioned, we've been staffing the project beyond our 2 staff people and working a lot of nights and weekends. So we want to have some advice on some focus on what you'd like to hear about. So cyclosiloxanes, obviously there's agreement that we want follow-up on that. There was brought up on other siloxanes. There's the pesticides, plasticizers. There's the emerging drinking water disinfection byproducts, the glycol ethers, and there's also a proposal from the public that I believe the panel received and is also in the back of the room on triclocarban. In terms of other possible topics, there's also just been discussion of considering potential priority chemicals. So we'd like panel input on what potential priority chemicals are of greatest interest to the panel, and also the type of documentation that you'd be interested in on the priority chemicals. Here I just wanted to briefly remind you of the criteria for priority chemicals, which is directly from the legislation. This is just an abbreviation of the criteria. The first is the degree of potential exposure. The second is the likelihood of a chemical being a carcinogen or toxicant. The third is the limit of laboratory detection. And then the next is that there can be other criteria that the panel may agree to. So that's another possible meeting agenda topic. And I just wanted to note as well that there will be some input on this topic from the state expert and public reports, public participation reports that are nearly complete and will be provided to you and released to the public soon. Okay, so that's just sort of an initial outline for your discussion.
All right, thank you for that presentation. So what I didn't see that there was a
Sorry,
handout.
Dr. Marino. Let me just
Sure.
follow up one thing. I also realized in terms of what just happened with antimicrobials and hormones, that should also be part of your discussion in terms of the follow-up that you want to do on that.
Okay, thank you. I didn't see a handout, so we'll probably be relying on your slides, referring to your slides that are up here. Okay, thanks. All right, the two things that we're looking at, I think, considering is the list follow-up on the chemicals that have been discussed, and then chemicals that we haven't discussed yet. And the other is how we want in the next agenda. For the next meeting, do we want to take some steps to set this panel up to start talking and having serious discussions about prioritizing? So those are the two things I think that we can discuss at this time. So where would the panel like to start at this point?
I guess I have a clarifying question. Where did you go? There you are. That the substances listed here are of interest for potential designation. That's what, right?
Yeah, this list is the additional potential designated.
Right. So that has to happen before we have a discussion of prioritization, right?
Well, yeah, we talked about this before. So the law doesn't require you to prioritize all designated chemicals. So you have your pool of designated chemicals, and you have possible priority chemicals that you can draw from the designated chemicals. So you could choose, you could actually choose that if, for example, if you had a broad consensus that there was a priority chemical of great interest, you don't have to wait until you've gone through every possible designated chemical. We see it as an ongoing process where you could reconsider, add to the designated chemical list, and also choose priority chemicals on an ongoing way. And that can also change, over time. It's not a static list.
We were wondering, just to review, now we pretty well eliminated all metals except for vanadium, which we folded into the mixture. just for our memory, I'm trying to remember how we got rid of all the metals. I think
We didn't. All the metals were designated. Or not
they're
all
all
of them, but all the
designated,
CDC
but
metals.
there were no other than vanadium was the only thing that we brought in that was new.
It's not a CDC.
It's not on a CDC list. Yeah, that's what I meant. I mean, I remember discussing a lot of metals, and they're all covered. Okay.
Actually, that brought another topic to mind that actually came up on the state report and in some internal discussions. Nano silver was raised as another as well. So obviously, I should clarify that this is not a complete list of everything you might want to look at, but this is some of the things that have already been discussed and brought out.
Okay. Well, I guess if we're going to have a discussion about this sort of set of priorities, is that what we're going to do at this point?
It's up to us. I think at this point we have to. I would hope that this is the time for us to talk about maybe the process. As you recall, this panel had a discussion of the process we're going to take to designate chemicals, and now we may want to have a brief discussion of what process are we going to agree upon to pick the priority chemicals, right? Okay. We have the criteria for what process we want to take. And sure, and I just want to remind the public that there will be an opportunity for public comment on this section of the agenda.
Well, I guess I would like to have a discussion about the pesticide arena, given its importance in California and also in consumer products in California, as a topic for designation, based on the criteria that Sarah described. So, are we? I'm just confused on the process here. If we are trying to identify from this list what we want to talk about next meeting, so
yeah, I mean, basically, there's a lot of topics,
right.
And clearly, the agenda is going to be too jam-packed.
Right.
So we basically just want some advice on what you all consider to be the most important things to talk about at the next meeting.
Thank you. Okay, so given that, my sense from this list would be that we do need to try to address the pesticides, and build on some of the work that we've done in that arena.
Just to clarify that.
Sure.
So I think I agree. You're suggesting we should make that high on our agenda. I don't want to say priority. That's the wrong word to say here.
Go there.
But make it high on our agenda that we discuss and make a decision about pesticides. And I would also add we may be ready to take some sort of action on siloxanes.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think, it's interesting, I think, we're in different levels with different substances, but when you look at the diesel mixture, and given time issues, we might want to see if we can start working in two realms. I mean, can we work in designating and starting to set priorities for ones that we've already been through?
Oh, sure.
Because if we have enough information, because we asked for some new information on diesel, it's already been designated, but maybe we should get to work trying to go through diesel and even flame retardants to see if we can start setting priority next meeting. So we'll do a little of both, a little bit of work in designation, a little bit of work in setting priority. That's just sort of a suggestion, not a...
Okay, so what I'm hearing is we've already agreed, or we had some consensus earlier today that we're going to have follow-up discussion on cyclosiloxanes. Okay, and there's a recommendation that staff prepare to present information on pesticides for the panel for the next meetings, so the panel can may want to make a recommendation based on the information that's presented on pesticides, may make a recommendation to designate pesticides as well. Is that correct? Certain pesticides, okay. More discussion?
And then perhaps what we should do beyond that is have any staff energy focused towards helping to identify potential priority chemicals. And so beyond the cyclosiloxanes and the pesticides, I guess we might want to actually also bring to closure the animal husbandry chemicals that we started to discuss today. So those plus the pesticides, and then focused on priority chemicals. And to that end, I would think it might be helpful for various panel members to identify or speak a little bit about what they're thinking about with regard to criteria for prioritization or specific chemicals on the CDC list or ones that we've already designated that might be potential priorities, so that then we can figure out what questions might need to be answered before the next meeting so that we could set priority chemicals.
Okay. So, Jane, if I heard, please go ahead.
I don't want us to forget that hanging out there is the possibility of adding more criteria to the list. And it seems to me we ought to figure out the criteria before we start actually choosing chemicals to discuss.
Okay, so there's what I'm hearing so far from the panel is 3 classes of chemicals that we want to we would like presented at the next meeting for the panel to consider. And I'm also hearing that that we would like to have some discussion on priorities. And now, Dr. Solomon, did I understand that you said that you're interested in maybe allowing the program staff to return with recommendations for priorities based on the criteria? Is that what?
Well, what I was thinking is that in the next few minutes, perhaps panel members could propose either criteria or individual chemicals or groups of chemicals that people would like to see brought before us for the next meeting for consideration for identification as priority chemicals. And so anybody who has an opinion along those lines maybe should speak now so they know where to put their energies and what to include in the notice for the next meeting.
Yeah, this is probably very redundant, but the criteria you do have that are specified in the law are laid out behind tab 3 on page 2. So you have those 3 criteria. And Gina, I assume you're only referring to any additional criteria beyond those 3, because the CDC reports for, say, all of the CDC chemicals do have summaries of this information, right, that would really suffice, well, in our opinion, would suffice to meet criteria 1, 2, and 3. So.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll be clearer then on the pesticide side of things. That what I'm interested in is pesticides of high use that we have discussed previously in California that do not appear on the CDC list, and that were those pesticides were identified earlier by the panel and appeared in the first briefing materials provided to the panel, and then the second would be the pesticide ingredients that appear in consumer products that have been identified by the Air Resources Board.
So, Lauren Zeiss with OEA, that again would be a follow-up piece that we would do in terms of possible designated chemicals. We would bring that to you in that way.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Culver?
I would just, in looking at these 3 criteria for the prioritization of chemicals and then kind of thinking about the discussion that we had yesterday having to do with the kind of sense of urgency of actually being able to start undertaking some analyses and having some results come out of this program, that maybe another criterion we might want to think about, at least sort of for the initial cut, would be, the feasibility of what can the labs actually, do, say, in the next year to 2 years, and looking at the presentations that Peter and Myrto made yesterday, giving us a good overview of the kinds of things that might be possible, so that really, at least for the first set of priority chemicals, I think that kind of is important to take into consideration and might want to be one of our criteria.
The only caveat I would add to that is that it would be helpful for us to have perhaps on the relevance of AB 289 to this process, that perhaps with consultation with DTSC, who's it sounds like they're at this point using that law, that might affect that question.
May I comment here? I don't think it would help, because if you were to request AB 289 now, it will be about a year before they can send you the method, and it will take us more time to adapt and try out that method. So in terms of timing, Dr. Ruder specified that if you want something to be done now, it should be something that we can do already now.
Yeah, and even though there's this year that's specified in AB 289 to produce methods to give to us, there's not much in the way of enforcement mechanisms, and if they decide not to do it, or if it takes much longer than that, we can't really rely on that as something that would be incorporated into our process in the near future. It is yet to be tested even, I believe, so we don't even know how well that mechanism's going to work.
I'm hearing a high degree of uncertainty about that. Skepticism, perhaps. Okay. I guess, though, it would be, I'm interested in hearing how it is being used by DTSC, and if in fact they're running into this problem or not.
Sure. We can give you an update on it.
Yeah. Okay.
We're not there yet. I mean, there's a mechanism that started, but it's only the beginning.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, we have 2 comments. Go ahead.
So I wanted to suggest as a possible criteria to add in considering priority chemicals is specificity or uniqueness to California.
And I'd like to build on what Dr. Luderer said. I think that for identifying priority chemicals, a lot is really going to hinge on the lab and what's feasible within a reasonable time frame. And I found the presentations yesterday extremely helpful. And what I would love to see is a somewhat maybe expanded version of that type of presentation that the presentation yesterday was assuming the full implementation of the program, 1,000 samples, the big rollout that we now know that we're probably not going to get anytime in the near future. So maybe looking at a somewhat smaller samples. No? Shaking your heads?
No, that wasn't my intention at all. That was to explain to you what we could do in terms of analytic chemistry if we were not fully engaged in the sample management issue. If all of our limited resources, all the chemists who are in the laboratory now, focused on doing sample analysis, where you brought the samples, you dropped them on our doorstep, we logged them in, tested them, and gave you the results. So there was no sample management. That's what freed up the staff that we now have, or would free up the staff we now have to do chemical analysis. Otherwise, if we were going to do the study where we're out there involved in sample collection in the community study or any kind of alternative to the archive sample collaborations, right, we have to redirect staff towards those sample management activities and away from sample testing. So the 1,000 samples, 1,000 urine, for example, is based on just doing the testing, not doing any of the sample management.
I understand that, but though at one point yesterday you did say that the rationale for calculating 1,000 was you were trying to figure out if what it would take or for how many chemical groups you would be able to actually hit that to get the 2,000.
There was no target to get the 2,000. That was we were just telling you what we thought we could do for those different panels, and it came out to be order of magnitude 1,000 per year.
Right. That's different from what I heard. But anyway, all right. Anyway, there were other. So if there's no purpose to decreasing the sample size, though I would think that that might help a little bit with cost, then the other thing would be to look at other chemical groups because there were several that weren't listed. So I would be interested in, now that the flame retardants are designated, taking a look at what, laying out a scenario whereby some subset of flame retardants could be included, and what that would involve in terms of trade-offs, whether there would be any opportunity to do anything in addition to the flame retardants if those were done, or if that would be all, and to sort of cost it out for us.
So if I understand.
And then there are some chemicals on the CDC list that similarly might be of interest. You looked at a scenario with the organophosphates. The pyrethroids are coming in to replace the OPs for quite a few household uses, and so they would be of some interest. I'm curious what that would involve. And then there's other chemicals like perchlorate, which is of widespread concern in California. What's it doing perchlorate? Could it be bundled with anything else or not? What would be the cost and trade-offs involved with doing that? So those are the kinds of questions that I would think would interest me.
Can I see if I understand you? You'd like us to broaden the scope of the chemicals that we might look at, say reduce the number of sample analyses and introduce more types of chemicals, do pyrethroids in addition to the ones we suggested, maybe do perchlorate in addition to the ones we suggested, doing fewer samples but more panels.
I'd be interested in that, and I'd also be interested in sort of, you presented, for example, 3 categories. I think it was, OPs, phthalates / BPA, and PAHs, and said you could do 2 out of those 3. And so, if you add a few bits there, flame retardants, perchlorate, pyrethroids, how many out of that menu could you do in what combos with that sort of limited pool of resources? And there might be others that would similarly fall, would be worth looking at too. Because I don't know if that means you could do, BPA and phthalates and perchlorate and pyrethroids, or if it would be, all the money would be blown on perchlorate, or those are the kinds of questions that we're going to have to look at if we're trying to come up with a subset of priorities.
Okay.
Kind of a related question, which we talked about this morning a little bit, was whether the hydroxylated aromatic compounds in diesel exhaust could possibly be bundled with the PAHs that are part of the panel that CDC measures. So that might be, that would also be useful information in terms of trying to choose priority chemicals.
If I may, just for a moment, so far, I just want to summarize periodically where we're at. Getting back to the chemicals that the panel wants to hear more information on next time, I still have a follow-up discussion on the hormones and antimicrobials that was presented today, pesticides not on the CDC list, and cyclohexyloxanes, correct? Those are the three classifications or chemicals that we're going to have further discussion next time. In addition to that, there's been a couple of comments on suggestions for possible additional criteria that are consistent with statute under section 105449B. There's 4 criteria we can use, the 4th one being other criteria that the panel may agree to. And I just reworded a couple of comments that were provided by panel members. One of those suggestions would be to add to the list of criteria something like the limits of laboratory capacity, and keeping in mind that the broad sense could be staffing, it could be resources, funding, equipment. The other suggestion that I heard was something like one of the criteria being characteristics of chemical use unique to California. So those are the only two that I've heard. So is that, so far that's what I'm hearing. Is that correct, panel members?
Dr. Moreno, you might want to not limit it only to use, but you might want to say exposure, so characteristics of chemical use or exposure that are unique to California.
Okay.
But friendly amendment, could we say something like, I hate to say unique because that implies that it can't be found anywhere else in the world, but somewhat particular to California, or where, because I think we're of special interest to California. I think we all know what we're trying to say, but I don't want to also get us into a box where we have to show that that this is completely unique.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Zeiss.
Yeah, and so what I'm hearing is that at the meeting we will notice that there will be a discussion of criteria for the criteria that the panel may agree to, and these are the criteria you want to explore at that meeting. So we'll have an agenda item on that before you move to considering priority chemicals.
Yes, and I guess if I could just quickly ask Dr. Zeiss for counsel, since we're not, for today's agenda, we didn't tell the public that we're going to pick those additional criteria. So we can discuss it, but we're not going to pick criteria, or can we go ahead and pick criteria today?
Yeah, it's, you can have the discussion. I wouldn't make any decisions on priority because
No, not the priority, the criteria to make the priority.
The criteria either, because that was not in the notice.
Oh, okay. All right.
You can have the discussion, but not
All right.
a decision.
Thank you.
Just another point of clarification. So what I understood from Dr. Luderer's comments was that the question is also a focus for laboratory feasibility is in the near term. And so, of course, further out, we'll have more capacity as we get more familiar with the analyses and so forth. So it is just the near-term analyses, yes.
I have a brief question or comment. I hope this isn't a step backward, but CDC has changed a number of their analyses for NHANES, and they've expanded their list. I don't think actually they're planning to produce reports like the exposure reports that they've done in the past, but there's some compounds now that they're doing that aren't on this list. There's also some that they've developed methods for example, Homeland Security, but are not they're not necessarily doing for NHANES. So there's potentially other resources that CDC has, and I don't know if that would affect our designated list.
So my understanding is that the chemicals that are written up and part of their overall reporting would be included in the designated chemicals as designated chemicals. So at the next meeting, we will bring those to you as well. Okay. So you have materials on them.
So not necessarily a method, but whether they have actually done measurements and produced some sort of publicly available document.
That's my understanding. And maybe Carol can follow up with just confirming in terms of the legislation, either now or before the next meeting.
Yeah, we'll have to look at what actually seems to be involved here, because it's certainly not just NHANES, but we'll have to see exactly what they meant.
Yeah, and they have a full discussion of the new reporting on their website.
Right.
So this is part of the documentation for the priority chemicals. One possibility that was already brought up by Michael was the possibility of using for the CDC chemicals what the CDC has already written up on those chemicals. We do have an example if you'd like us to put it up on the screen to get a feel for what we're talking about. But I guess we have a question if that would suffice for your discussion in considering priority chemicals. You have to make a decision, but just some indication of how you would consider that information. maybe as we get that up, you can continue on your discussion.
Okay. Yes.
George Alexeyev, I had another. Actually, I think it's a continuation of Dr. Solomon's thought from yesterday, which we haven't come back to, and that was there were 3 possible scenarios for types of studies that could be done. One was those related to the RFI. Another one were community studies, and the third one, maybe it's part of community studies, but where the CDC would be able to do sampling and assist in the analysis. Now, maybe those 3 overlap, but and as a result of that, Dr. Solomon was recommending that we look at priority chemicals that we would want CDC to do in that type of analysis. So my thought was, I was wondering whether it would be helpful at the next meeting to think about chemicals that would be useful specifically to analyze in some specific kind of study we might be trying to put together. Because
if I may, just to follow up on that, thanks for bringing that up, because I actually think that the criteria for the chemical selection for the study that CDC will do for us, which I understood to be pretty much the same as what we were calling the community study, is that I would think those criteria would be a little bit different. We're no longer constrained by our laboratory feasibility and capacity, but rather by CDC's. So some of the chemicals that we just designated today, for example, would not be things that we could ask them for, but we could pick from the entire CDC list and not worry about, I guess there's 10 categories then at our disposal. And so one of the two, and I think since that's a one-time thing, I'm not even sure that counts as setting priority chemicals. I would argue that be advising staff, the committee's role there is just to advise staff on some chemicals that might be of interest to include in a pilot study, and that the discussion around priority chemicals would be a little bit different. It would be sort of, for going forward through the California program and the California labs. And so I don't know exactly what the forum is for having the discussion about the pilot study and the chemicals that would be worth including for that. And also whether we should wait till the next meeting or whether we should encourage staff to, my bias might be to, staff has, I think, heard a discussion from this panel yesterday, and maybe we could encourage them to move forward and put together a proposal for doing a community-based study with CDC support and, bring us a proposal at the next meeting.
Could I suggest that maybe one of the criteria be changed a little bit to say something like the availability and limits of state and federal laboratory, because that CDC offer it's one time, but there may be opportunities in the future, and as availability is there, the panel can look at making certain chemicals priorities.
Again, it's not clear to me that you need to consider what we'd ask the CDC to do as priority chemicals. Another way of thinking about it is that it's providing you some information on feasibility and whether or not they would be important to sample in California. So I think that, there is another way of looking at what the CDC will do for us. It's not something they're going to do for us on an ongoing basis, so it provides us an opportunity to explore what the best possibilities are.
Okay, I think Dr. Lutter, do you have a comment?
I was really going to say basically what you just said, that I think that we do want to think about what the chemicals would be that the CDC might measure, because those results might form the basis for deciding that we want to make one of those classes of chemicals priority subsequently for the lab here. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could just respond to Dr. Solomon's comment too, we were planning to go forward with exploring different options with say with the UCSF and with CDC, and we may not have like a full NIH proposal in February for the next meeting, but we will have something that we'll present to you for your input on.
I'm trying to think what would be the most useful form of providing the information on these designated chemicals for consideration as priority chemicals at the next meeting. Chemicals, hundreds of chemicals, there's quite a few groups. I wonder, we could sort of provide you this written information, which would be a lot of pages to sift through, but I'm also wondering if it would be useful to develop kind of a matrix where we could take the criteria and at least have the first cut of sort of summarizing the criteria as applied to these designated chemicals.
We could go ahead and produce something like that. In fact, DPH and OEA staff have started on such a matrix, so that would be feasible to do before the next meeting. And what we could do is provide the third report from CDC, which provides the kind of discussion up for phthalates as background for the panel, because it does go through and discuss the individual basically the underlying information for different criteria. So we could produce that, get that to the panel, and it's available to the public on the website, so very easily accessible. We don't have to produce reams of paper to send out. And then we could also provide this matrix. And in addition, to get at those additional chemicals that aren't included in the third report, CDC has write-ups on those that they have on their website, so we could provide those as well. They're very clear, very understandable.
Yeah.
Okay, we have Dr. Bradman, and then actually, you can go next. Go ahead.
Okay.
Asa?
Well, I just had a comment or I wanted clarification. You talked about maybe it was you talked about the laboratory feasibility as a criteria for setting priority chemicals. And I would actually think we might want to set priority chemicals in some case independent of laboratory feasibility, because that could set in motion a process that would define those as laboratory methods that need attention. It could trigger an AB 2889 request that we think these things may be very important, but we just can't do it. In other words, they are a priority, and some attention needs to be done.
Thank you. If I could get some clarification on the statute, these four criteria to designate the priority chemicals. They're not. We don't have to meet each of those criteria, correct? We can consider them, but one chemical for priority doesn't necessarily have to meet each of those three criteria, does it? Which means if we set if we add two more criteria to this, now we have five criteria. If a chemical, if we look at a chemical addresses 4 of the 5, the panel could still recommend that chemical as a priority, right?
Yeah, I don't think that there's certainly no hierarchy or requirement that all of these necessarily need to be met. I think there are considerations that you need to look at, but you know, they're not kind of either or questions in any way. So
okay.
And once again, you know, these are recommendations, and so you're giving advice, and the program still has to make the decisions in the long run. So.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Dr. Bremen.
I guess in following up Ace's thought that I in agreement to some extent with that on the laboratory capacity question, and maybe rather than defining the laboratory capacity as a criteria, it be a consideration, and that the suggestion that there be a matrix that allows us to sort of look at this set of substances based on some measures of these various criteria, that there be a measure of the laboratory capacity in there as a consideration, whether it's analytical method, cost, or whatever you think is the best method for us to understand, to get a good sense of how we can best consider laboratory capacity. I worry about it setting it as an absolute criteria for the reasons that Asa describes.
If the panel is in agreement that there needs to be some consideration of the laboratory and as a criteria, perhaps we could let the program come back with a recommendation on how to word that criteria that best suits the intent of the panel and the abilities of the laboratories.
Excuse me, this is Carol Monahan Cummings. I just wanted to point out it's 3:45. We haven't had the public comment, and I don't know how the court reporter is doing. Do you have to leave right at 4? But you probably need a break right at 4 or pretty close. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we could take a break at 4 unless we're finished at 4. But we do need to take public comment. So at this time, is there anyone currently here that has public a comment they want to share? Okay. We do have one. Mr. Baltz.
Davis Baltz, Commonweal. I guess this will be our last chance for public comment today, so I do appreciate you making room at many points during the day. I think we made some good progress today from my point of view, especially in the morning as we actually designated two classes of chemicals. From my point of view, having watched this program evolve for quite a while now, I am concerned that we can continue to make progress, and when we come into our next meeting, we can actually have some proposals for prioritization. I think we have a two-step process here. In addition to the CDC chemicals, then we're designating additional chemicals, and then after we designate them, then the next meeting or after that we get to prioritization. So coming back again to what we discussed yesterday about something of an imperative from many of our points of view that the program would do itself a favor by generating some data. We need to have some priority chemicals so that we can direct the program to go ahead and start doing some biomonitoring. So this is just from my point of view. I hope that we can, at the end of the next meeting, actually have some list of priority chemicals that we could actually start testing for. Yesterday, I think there was, I don't know if I would say consensus, but there was a lot of agreement that the mother-child cohort that was proposed, maybe using UCSF, had a lot of merit to it to forward to CDC. So obviously we still need to figure out how to pay for collecting the samples and shipping them to CDC. But that would be something else that when we come into our next meeting, if we could sort of come to an agreement that we did want to pursue that option as opposed to some other community study, or put 2 or 3 on the table with the intention to decide which one we want to pursue. I think that would be helpful. Another idea that sort of came up in trying to raise the profile of the program is have something like an open house for the lab. And I think that would be a good idea to sort of open the doors, show the new equipment that's been purchased, have some and invite notable people in Sacramento and elsewhere to come and learn about the program, so that then we can build on that interest, not only among policymakers but also among the public. In terms of the lab capacity, that's obviously going to have a big impact on which chemicals get tested. I heard yesterday that on the organic side, could maybe do the perfluorinated or the POPs. I guess I'm thinking now of, but we need to decide sometime soon if we're going to go the POPs route or the perfluorinated route. And so this may be something else to bring back to the next meeting, which classes of chemicals, if we can't actually get to prioritize them, which ones are going to give us the most value. And among, finally, the chemicals that are already designated from being on the CDC list that I would personally like to see advertised. I think some discussion on bisphenol A would be welcome. There's been a lot of developments just in the last couple of months, and of course we had a bill in Sacramento this year as well, but I think that should be something that might be worth talking about. So I want to thank the panel members for all of their work since the last meeting, and I also want to thank all the staff who gave the wonderful presentations today and worked weekends and evenings, and I know that you're given a lot to do, and it's really appreciated by those of us who are watching the program develop. So thanks.
We received one comment from Dr. Rebecca Sutton with the Environmental Working Group, and Dr. Sutton says that the Environmental Working Group supports the biomonitoring of widely used antimicrobial agents and pesticides, including triclosan, triclocarban, and nanosilver, all mentioned briefly during this meeting. The science guidance may need further information on these chemicals to designate or prioritize them. Triclosan and triclocarban are potent endocrine-disrupting compounds, and preliminary evidence shows that nanosilver is significantly more toxic to mammalian cells than silver ions. We also strongly advocate biomonitoring for phthalates and BPA, as described by Dr. Peter Flessel yesterday. Thanks for the opportunity to comment.
All right. Panel members, we have 10 minutes before we lose two of our panel members. So at this time, 8 minutes. Again, if I could go over what is, I'm sorry. Oh, Dr. Solomon.
Yeah, sorry, I've been waiting a while. So I guess I have two things. In regard to the public comment, I'm now increasingly worried that we'll paint ourselves into a corner if we say that that priorities have to be somehow particular to California, because it's clear that there are some ones that are of great concern to the commenters that are of great concern to me as well, and very widespread, and that are not necessarily particular to California. So as long as we see these criteria as being ones where we don't have to meet them all, and you know, Dr. Wilson already pointed out that there's some pros and cons to saying, well, we have to make lab feasibility a hard and fast rule. So I think we'll be all right as long as it's clear that it's not and we have to meet everything down the checklist. But my biggest concern is that designating chemicals is this panel's easy job, because there's not really any limit on the number of things we can designate. It's not setting quite as many wheels in motion to do so, and yet today, full day meeting, we had 5 chemicals or groups of chemicals on the agenda and got through 2 of them. And so I'm a little concerned about the pace of our ability to do the really hard job, which is priority setting. And what I'd like to request is that we not approach priority setting by going laboriously through each individual chemical or groups of chemicals, starting at the top of the CDC list all the way to the bottom, or else we're not going to get there. And so what I would propose is that this, indeed, we use the CDC document, that the staff produce this matrix, and that the staff come up with the set of recommendations or a short set of options for what we might want to set as priorities. And then the committee can then respond to those, can propose alternatives, and have the discussion around some options that are pretty well laid out and would be a manageable size. Otherwise, we're going to end up kind of bogged down, I'm afraid.
If I could, we have just a few more minutes. If I can summarize what the next meeting may look like. which would include that last recommendation. Next meeting could look like this. We have further presentation and discussion on those 3 classes of chemicals that the panel this afternoon mentioned, and similar to the process that we had yesterday and today, the panel may make recommendations for designating chemicals. That could be followed with a discussion and a discussion of additional criteria and recommendations or creating additional criteria by the panel for recommending priority chemicals. And that could be followed with a presentation of the designated chemicals, the criteria for recommending priorities, and a presentation by program staff to get the conversation going on what those priority chemicals could be, focusing on those priority chemicals using the criteria that have been established. So that's how I'm possibly seeing the next meeting going, and that would allow us time to finish some discussions we had and someone can make a recommendation from the panel to designate some chemicals early in that meeting, and then move into applying the criteria with work that the program staff have already done, and move us into the discussions of the most likely chemicals that will be priorities.
Sorry to add one more thing. I fully agree with the chair's summary. I just wanted to again to what Dr. McCone said earlier about wanting to test for tomorrow's chemicals, not yesterday's chemicals. And I've heard that sentiment from a number of other panel members, and I'm not sure it quite maybe it rises to the level of being something that we should propose as one of our criteria. But at a minimum, I think it's worth reminding ourselves of it and having staff keep that in mind as they come up with a list of potential chemicals to designate as priority chemicals.
I would agree with that, and I don't know if you included the presentation of a matrix in that, and perhaps it was subsumed in your agenda there. One thing I would like to add also is the opinion from OEHA Council on AB 289. Yeah.
Could we have that that presentation? Well, I guess staff can make a recommendation on how to set up that agenda, but early enough so that as decisions are being made, we have that information available to us. Thanks. Yeah. All right.
2 things. Did you mention the community study and the presentation on that in that list?
No, I didn't. We're going to have an update there too.
Mm-hmm. And the second thing that I just went back and looked at and noticed is on the presentation Sarah gave this morning that started today's agenda, her 3rd slide, where we have the CDC chemicals, then the designated chemicals, and then the priority chemicals, and then after priority chemicals is feasibility, which then leads to which chemicals are actually biomonitored. So I just wanted to point out, as we're talking about criteria, that feasibility is actually in the model already after we determine priorities. So we can, it frees us up to determine priorities sort of free of feasibility, and then let fees play a role in deciding what actually gets biomonitored.
Okay, I'm sorry, come back to last comments from our 2 panel members that need to leave? Make sure you guys had an opportunity. Okay. All right. Joan?
I'm just back to Gina's comment earlier. I think, again, we have to kind of keep in mind that one of the purposes of the program is to be able to reflect on the success of the regulatory programs, the environmental contaminant regulatory programs. That's one of the purposes of the biomonitoring program. So somehow we have to kind of dovetail the old with the new somehow, because that is a key element of the program. Something to keep in mind along with all these other things.
I totally agree. I think what I was thinking about more from a personal perspective, I think maybe PCBs and many of the organochlorine pesticides, sort of going far enough back that I'm not as sure that they would be as high a priority, at least for me. Some of the chemicals in recent use where we're very interested in knowing whether their use is indeed diminishing, or whether exposure is indeed diminishing specifically as a result of regulations or actions here in California. Those, I think, would be very important.
I think perhaps that could be one of the considerations should the panel adopt a criteria that includes characteristics of chemical use and exposure that would apply. We could also look at past, current, or future use. Yeah. There's only 2 criteria so far that I've heard from panel members. One was that characteristics that are unique, well, not unique, but our program staff will come up with some recommended language, but basically something, chemicals unique to California and chemicals that take into consideration the capacity of the laboratories.
If I could ask one question before we lose whichever panel members we're about to lose, but it would be helpful if we could get some direction on the antimicrobials and animal husbandry otherwise, because we're not going to be able to discuss this with panel members after this meeting until the next one, and I'd like us to be able to go forward to some extent on those topics.
My understanding
What more would you like to see?
What more? Okay, thank you. Okay, Dr. Litter and Dr. Culver have to leave now. The question for Dr. Zeiss is, do we have any other requests of the program staff that they could bring with them to the next meeting before we have the discussion that we postponed on antimicrobials? Anything else?
When was your thought about the next meeting? What's the timing for the next meeting? That's quite a few things that we need to put together and so forth.
Yeah, I think we need to put our heads together with all of our staff because, as you've heard from the labs, timing is very critical. So, before we make any commitments, if we could talk among ourselves. I guess February would probably be about the earliest. Mm-hmm. But it's up to, we've got to talk with staff.
Well, I think Dr. Luderer was working on the antimicrobials, right? But she just stepped out. In responding to your question, Dr. Reisman, in terms of panel input for you, I think she was working on that, right? Does anybody remember?
Yeah, she was the lead on those, and I don't believe that, I don't have any outstanding questions and would feel comfortable, making a recommendation on each, not necessarily the same recommendation for each category, but, making recommendations one way or the other on those. It was just the fact that we ran out of time. Yeah. So I wouldn't request anything else from staff at this point.
Mm-hmm. And I think the thought was that there wasn't time to complete the item today. So the panel heard the information, the panel heard the staff presentation, but the time for the panel discussion, we just ran out of time. So, which would mean that we would be another item for the next agenda.
I hope we don't have to redo the presentation at the next next meeting.
Does that give you what you need, Dr. Reisman? Okay. Okay, yeah. Who's going to do? Go ahead.
Maybe I could mention that we got another comment sort of out of the on the synthetic hormones that I'll put into the record but won't read for the purposes of today, from Dr. Meglina Wilbur.
All right. At this point, I believe that's it. Are there any other further comments by panel members? I don't see any. I'm sorry.
I'd take a break for the court reporter, at least briefly, before we close the meeting. Are you okay to go? Okay. All right. Okay. We just had to double check. He's supposed to be every 2 hours.
Okay. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Dr. George Alexieff, who will give a summary of today's event. Thanks.
Okay, this is George Alexeyev. Well, yesterday we spoke primarily about smaller scale biomonitoring studies in light of the current funding situation, and a couple of the issues raised were to focus these studies on community studies that were meaningful to larger populations, possibly a maternal child type of design, and to also focus on descriptive information that one could obtain. Today, we discussed an overview of the designated chemicals and the role of the SGP in identifying them, and we followed up on potentially designated chemicals that were at the June meeting. Documents were produced on 6 of these chemicals, or 6 of these chemicals or groups of chemicals. Regarding diesel exhaust and vanadium, there was discussion about the difficulty in measurement of it, and that possibly that some methods could be produced in the future. And as a result of the discussion of diesel exhaust and vanadium, the panel recommended unanimously that diesel exhaust be added to the list of designated chemicals of the biomonitoring program. We discussed brominated and chlorinated flame retardants, and it appeared that there were a number of methods available for these compounds. And the panel unanimously recommended that brominated and chlorinated organic compounds used as flame retardants be included, used as flame retardants, including but not limited to those specifically listed on page 2 and 32 of the staff report, be added to the list of chemicals for the biomonitoring program. We also discussed siloxanes, and some additional materials were being requested from both staff and the public regarding this compound to be discussed at a later meeting. There was a recommendation to postpone, but it was a split vote, but resulted in us waiting until the next meeting to get some additional materials. There was a presentation about antimicrobials used in animal husbandry, as well as synthetic hormones used in animal husbandry. We weren't able to complete the item, and we'll continue with the item at the next meeting. We discussed the update. We discussed the next meeting and what might be on the agenda. There will be a follow-up of the items that we didn't complete at this meeting: the cyclosiloxanes, the animal husbandry chemicals, and also. I believe there's a request for us to look at additional pesticides that are in high use but not on the CDC list. Finally, there would be a discussion of the criteria for recommending priorities, including discussion of potential priority chemicals, and an update on the smaller scale biomonitoring studies. Oh, also an update on the staff update on the opinion of 289, AB 289. That concludes my summary.
Okay. I don't think there's any other business. I think we're done. So we'll conclude this meeting, and we'll hear from staff in the near future as plans for the next biomonitoring panel meeting, right? Thank you very much. Oh, before we leave, I and Dr. Denton would like to thank Dr. Peter Plessel for, again, when it comes to thanks, I'm a man of few words, so actually I say thank you, and I mean it sincerely. Dr. Denton, do you have anything else to add?
That's pretty much what we wanted to do. Thank you, Peter. We wish you good luck in your retirement. We will miss you at these meetings, and we're not sure you'll miss us, but we know we'll miss you.
No, the feeling is absolutely mutual. And thank you all.